The night was thick with a humid, restless air. The streets of Studio City, normally vibrant with the chatter of Hollywood hopefuls and seasoned actors dining at exclusive spots, felt eerily quiet in the small parking lot outside Vitello's Italian restaurant. The warm glow of the restaurant's windows cast long shadows, distorting the figures moving in and out. It was a night like any other, a regular Friday evening where stars and industry people blended into the background of Los Angeles. Yet something felt off. A black Dodge Stealth, sleek and polished, sat idle in the parking lot. Inside, Bonnie Lee Bakley sat alone in the passenger seat, her fingers absently tapping against the dashboard. She had always been a woman with an agenda, a survivor who maneuvered through life on her own terms. But tonight, there was an unusual tension in her expression. It wasn't fear. Bonnie had learned to handle fear a long time ago. This was something else, an expectation, a sense of something imminent. Her husband, Robert Blake, had just stepped out, muttering something about forgetting his gun inside the restaurant. It was an odd detail. Why would he bring a gun to dinner in the first place? And why, of all things, would he leave it behind? Bonnie watched him disappear through the entrance of Vitello's, his tall frame swallowed by the dimly lit interior. She adjusted the rearview mirror, scanning the lot. Empty, except for a few distant figures moving along the sidewalk. She sighed and shifted in her seat, glancing at the car's clock. Less than a minute had passed since Blake left. Then it happened. Two sharp cracks shattered the night air. Not the muffled pop of fireworks or a car backfiring. This was different. Gunfire. Close. The first bullet tore through the silence. A brief, almost imperceptible pause before the second followed. Then, nothing. For a moment, there was no reaction. The city continued as it always had. Cars hummed in the distance, laughter trickled from the restaurant, and the neon lights from the signs above flickered indifferently. Then came the screaming. A bystander at the far end of the parking lot had witnessed something. A flash, a movement in the dark. Panic surged as a restaurant worker rushed out to see what had happened. Inside Vitello's, conversation stalled mid-sentence as heads turned toward the commotion outside. Robert Blake reemerged, moving with urgency, his eyes darting wildly. His breath hitched as he saw the car. His wife slumped motionless in the passenger seat, her blonde hair falling forward, a thin stream of blood trailing down her temple. The metallic scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air. Blake stumbled, his face contorting into something between shock and horror. He turned and bolted back inside the restaurant, shouting for help. His voice cracked, raw, desperate. "Call 911. Someone shot my wife." The staff at Vitello's exchanged uneasy glances before one of them grabbed the phone. Blake kept repeating himself, his voice rising, his panic echoing through the small dining space. The weight of the moment pressed down, suffocating in its intensity. When the first patrol car pulled into the lot, its red and blue lights slicing through the night, the scene had already taken shape. A woman slumped in the front seat of a luxury car, 2 bullet wounds to the head. A husband, a Hollywood actor, frantic, pacing. A crime with no apparent suspect, no weapon left behind. Officers approached cautiously, their hands instinctively hovering near their holsters. One of them leaned down to check for a pulse. Nothing. Bonnie Lee Bakley was dead. As backup arrived, the questions began. Too many, too soon. Where was Blake when the shots were fired? Why did he leave his wife alone in the car at that exact moment? If this was a random shooting, why was there no sign of robbery? Blake's breathing was heavy, erratic. His face twisted in disbelief as he answered. I was inside. I forgot my gun. I went back to get it. And when I came back," he broke off, gesturing helplessly toward the car, the horror in his eyes unmistakable. But something was off. One of the officers tilted his head slightly. "You left your wife alone in the car to get your gun?" Blake nodded, but his gaze wavered, as if realizing how strange it sounded. The paramedics arrived, pushing through the growing crowd. One of them took a cursory look at Bonnie's injuries. 2 shots, close range, execution style. A seasoned detective, arriving moments later, took a long, measured glance at the scene before speaking softly to one of his men. This wasn't random. That was when the true weight of the case settled. This wasn't a tragic accident, nor was it a senseless crime of opportunity. This was deliberate. And now the real question emerged. Who pulled the trigger? The investigation had begun. The crime scene outside Vitello's Italian restaurant had transformed into a spectacle of flashing police lights, caution tape, and murmuring voices. Officers moved swiftly, securing the area, while the forensic team set to work. The air was thick with tension, punctuated by the occasional crackle of police radios. The body of Bonnie Lee Bakley remained inside the black Dodge Stealth, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her blonde hair soaked in the blood that had streamed from the gunshot wounds. The scent of cordite still lingered, a stark reminder that only minutes ago, this had been a living, breathing woman. Detective John Marquez, a seasoned investigator with the LAPD, stood at the edge of the crime scene, surveying the scene with the weary eyes of a man who had seen too much. Something about this case felt different. The execution-style killing, the eerie stillness of the scene, and most of all, the unsettling fact that no one had seen the shooter. Nearby, Robert Blake sat on the curb, his elbows on his knees, his fingers threaded through his hair. His expression flickered between shock, grief, and something more elusive. His breathing was unsteady, but Marquez had seen enough grieving husbands to know that emotions didn't always tell the truth. When a woman was killed, the first suspect was almost always the man closest to her. A few feet away, uniformed officers collected evidence, their gloved hands methodical and precise. 2 shell casings lay just outside the car, barely reflecting the harsh artificial light from the street lamps above. Ballistics would later confirm that the bullets had come from a .380 caliber handgun, not a weapon Blake had registered. That alone didn't prove anything, but it raised questions. Marquez approached one of the officers standing near Blake and caught the tail end of his statement. I was inside, Blake was saying, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. I forgot my gun. I went back to get it. When I came back, she was just sitting there. Marquez studied him for a long moment. He was an actor, after all. Did his panic feel rehearsed? Forced? Or was it the genuine reaction of a man who had just stumbled upon his wife's murder? The detective had learned long ago that grief and guilt often look the same in the immediate aftermath of a crime. He took a step closer. Mr. Blake, he said evenly, his voice cutting through the noise. You said you went back inside to get your gun? Blake looked up at him, his eyes bloodshot. Yeah, he muttered. I left it in the booth. Marquez's expression didn't change, but something about the phrasing made him pause. Not a gun. My gun. Blake was emphasizing possession, as if he wanted to clarify before anyone even asked that the weapon he left inside wasn't the one that killed Bonnie. The gun you left inside, Marquez said, voice neutral. What kind is it? Blake swallowed hard. It's a .38 revolver. Not a .380, Marquez noted. Different caliber. But it was too soon to determine whether that exonerated him or not. Nearby, the forensic team was already at work, dusting for prints, taking photographs, searching for anything that might give them an immediate lead. But something wasn't right. There were no signs of forced entry into the car, no shattered glass, no evidence of a struggle. If Bonnie had seen her killer approaching, she hadn't resisted. Either she had been caught completely off guard, or, more likely, she had trusted the person who pulled the trigger. Blake wiped a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. Do you have any idea who did this? His voice cracked on the last word, his hands gripping his knees like he was holding on to something solid in a world that was suddenly spinning out of control. Marquez didn't answer. Instead, he turned his attention to the victim. Who was Bonnie Lee Bakley? That was the question now, because more often than not, the answer to that question led straight to the killer. Hours later, at the precinct, the investigation into Bonnie's life began in earnest. It didn't take long for the detectives to realize that she was far from the typical Hollywood wife. If anything, she was a woman who had spent her entire life living on the edge, always one step ahead of disaster, until tonight. Born in New Jersey, Bonnie had learned early how to survive. She had reinvented herself time and time again, using fake names, scams, and manipulation to secure financial stability. She had married at least 10 times, often under dubious circumstances. She had built a career out of conning men, luring them in with promises of love, only to leave them financially drained. Some might have called her a grifter, others would have called her a survivor. She was known for running mail-order scams, convincing men across the country to send her money in exchange for a fantasy that didn't exist. She was relentless, always moving, always planning her next step. But she had made enemies, a lot of them, which made this case even more complicated. Most homicides had clear suspects: disgruntled lovers, business rivals, or someone with a sudden burst of rage. But with Bonnie, the list of people who might have wanted her dead was long. And yet, despite all of this, she had managed to capture Robert Blake, a once beloved Hollywood actor, now aging and clinging to the remnants of his former fame. Their relationship had been tumultuous from the start. Bonnie had initially pursued another man, Christian Brando, the troubled son of Marlon Brando. And when she found out she was pregnant, she believed Brando was the father. But a DNA test revealed otherwise. The baby was Blake's. That was when everything changed. Blake had never wanted to marry Bonnie, but with a child in the picture, the pressure mounted. He reluctantly agreed, though those closest to him knew he resented her. Their marriage wasn't one of love, it was a business arrangement, a trap he had fallen into. And then Bonnie was dead. Marquez sat at his desk, staring at the case file, turning over the pieces in his mind. Bonnie had spent her life chasing men, chasing money, chasing security. And now she was dead in a parking lot, shot twice in the head. So the real question wasn't just who had killed Bonnie, it was who had finally caught up to her. The Los Angeles Police Department's homicide division was no stranger to high-profile cases, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just the murder of Bonnie Lee Bakley itself, tragic as it was, but the shadow it cast over Hollywood, the way it threatened to unravel secrets that had been carefully kept for years. The killing of a woman with a notorious past, married to a once revered actor, was bound to ignite a media firestorm. And for the detectives assigned to the case, it meant navigating through the noise to find the truth hidden underneath. Detective John Marquez sat at his desk in the precinct, flipping through the preliminary reports while the rest of the team compiled their notes. The evidence gathered at the crime scene had been logged, but there was an unsettling lack of clear leads. The forensic team had confirmed that the 2 bullet casings found near Bonnie's car came from a .380 caliber handgun, but no murder weapon had been recovered. The killer had been precise, quick, and had vanished without a trace. Marquez knew better than to believe in ghosts. Somewhere out there was a person who had pulled the trigger, someone with a motive strong enough to ensure that Bonnie Lee Bakley would never walk away from that parking lot alive. The question wasn't just who had done it, but why? And more importantly, how carefully had they planned it? The first step in any homicide investigation was simple: talk to the people closest to the victim. The detectives didn't need to look far. Robert Blake was still at the station, seated in an interrogation room, staring at the floor with bloodshot eyes. He had been cooperative, but Marquez could tell the man was exhausted. The adrenaline that had fueled his panic at the crime scene had begun to wear off, leaving behind something raw and difficult to read. Blake had been taken aside earlier for a more formal statement. He repeated the same sequence of events he had given at the scene: how he and Bonnie had dined at Vitello's, how he had left her in the car to retrieve the gun he had forgotten inside, how he had returned moments later to find her slumped over, lifeless, 2 bullets in her head. But something about his version of events wasn't sitting right. Marquez had handled enough homicide cases to know that people rarely remembered things in a perfect, linear order. Trauma had a way of distorting reality, making small details blurry or exaggerated. That was normal, but Blake's recollection felt too rehearsed, as if he had been preparing to explain himself long before anyone had started asking. The detectives also noted an interesting inconsistency, one that wasn't immediately damning, but certainly raised questions. Several witnesses from Vitello's, including the restaurant staff, contradicted Blake's timeline. While he claimed that he had rushed back inside for his gun and returned to the car within minutes, others suggested that he had been inside longer than he realized. Some even recalled him pausing, standing near the entrance, as if hesitating before going back outside. It wasn't definitive proof of anything. People's memories were flawed, and panic could warp perception. But in a case like this, every second mattered. Meanwhile, other detectives had begun looking into Bonnie's final hours before the murder. Who had she spoken to? Had she received any strange calls? Had she been acting fearful? Paranoid? That was when they discovered something chilling. Bonnie had in fact expressed concern for her safety in the days leading up to her death. A close friend told investigators that Bonnie had complained about feeling watched, that she had suspected someone was following her, but she hadn't been specific. She hadn't named anyone. This was a woman who had spent her life in the company of powerful, dangerous men. She was no stranger to threats or manipulation. So why now had she been afraid? The detectives began combing through her phone records, bank statements, and recent activity. What they found only deepened the mystery. In the last week before her death, Bonnie had made several unusual phone calls, some to unknown numbers, some to old acquaintances she hadn't spoken to in years. There were also transactions that seemed out of place. A cash withdrawal of several $1,000s made just days before the murder. Had she been trying to pay someone off? Was she planning to run? Or was this something else entirely? Back at the precinct, Marquez turned his focus to Robert Blake's demeanor. He was still in the interrogation room, but his posture had changed. He was no longer leaning forward, running his hands through his hair. He had gone quiet, still. Marquez watched through the two-way mirror for a moment, considering his options. This case wasn't just about Blake. There were other angles to explore, other people with possible motives. But whether Blake was guilty or not, he was hiding something. Detective Marquez knew the truth would come out eventually. It always did. The next step was to keep peeling back the layers. And this was just the beginning. The days leading up to a murder always hold answers. Somewhere within the web of routine activities, scattered conversations, and fleeting interactions, there is a moment where everything tilts, where a decision is made, a fate is sealed, a life is unknowingly counted down to its final seconds. For Bonnie Lee Bakley, those moments had existed, buried beneath the surface of her otherwise chaotic, calculated existence. The detectives knew that if they wanted to get closer to the truth, they needed to retrace her last steps, reconstruct her final days, and uncover what she may have known before she took her last breath. As the morning sun spread across Los Angeles, casting a golden hue over the city that never truly slept, Detective John Marquez leaned back in his chair at the precinct, flipping through Bonnie's phone records. The evidence team had worked through the night, pulling together a list of all outgoing and incoming calls in the days before her murder. A forensic analyst had already flagged a few interesting numbers, several of which didn't appear in Bonnie's usual call history. The first thing that stood out was the frequency. In the 3 days before her death, Bonnie had made a series of short, urgent phone calls, many of them to numbers that were either unregistered, temporary burners, or traced back to names that led nowhere. That wasn't necessarily surprising given her past, but the pattern was unusual. This wasn't someone engaging in casual conversations. This was someone trying to reach someone specific, repeatedly, as if she were desperate to get through. A particular number had been dialed 4 times the night before she was killed. The same number she had also called twice on the afternoon of the murder. When detectives traced it, the result was inconclusive. It was a prepaid phone, unregistered, a dead end on paper. But in the world of criminal investigations, dead ends were often signposts pointing in the right direction. Bonnie had been trying to contact someone, and that someone had made sure they couldn't be traced. Meanwhile, another troubling discovery surfaced. The forensic accountants, combing through Bonnie's financial activity, uncovered a withdrawal of $4,000 in cash from one of her accounts just 2 days before she was killed. That alone might not have raised alarms. Bonnie was no stranger to handling large sums of cash. But what made it suspicious was where the money had gone. It hadn't been spent. It hadn't been deposited elsewhere. It had vanished. No purchases, no receipts, no record of her handing it off to someone. Just a large amount of money pulled from her account, and then nothing. Detective Marquez exhaled, closing the folder momentarily. Money and secrecy, 2 things that had defined Bonnie's entire life. Had she been paying someone off? Had she been blackmailed? Was she trying to disappear? The timeline of her last interactions only made things murkier. A deeper dive into Bonnie's voicemails and messages painted a picture of a woman who, in her final hours, had been on edge, unsettled, and possibly even afraid. One voicemail, left for a friend the day before she was murdered, carried an eerie weight in hindsight. "I feel like someone's watching me. Like, I don't know. I don't feel safe. It's probably nothing, but if anything happens, just remember, okay?" She had laughed after saying it, dismissing it as paranoia. But the detectives didn't find it funny. They found it haunting. When people sensed something was wrong, they were usually right. There was no doubt anymore. Bonnie had known something was coming. She might not have known exactly who or when, but she had felt it. And now she was dead. The investigation expanded quickly. While Robert Blake remained a key figure in the case, detectives began to widen their scope, looking beyond just her marriage. If Bonnie had feared for her life, the answer might not have been inside her home. It could have been lurking somewhere in her past. Investigators compiled a list of people who had reasons to want Bonnie gone, and it was longer than they expected. Former lovers she had scammed or left behind, business associates who might have been owed money, family members who had distanced themselves from her, men who had once fallen for her, only to realize they had been used. And then, of course, there was the matter of Christian Brando, the man Bonnie had originally believed was the father of her child before DNA proved otherwise. He had been troubled, unpredictable, known for explosive behavior. Was he simply another unfortunate figure in Bonnie's complicated life, or had she provoked the wrong person? As the detectives went down the list, they realized that nearly everyone had a reason to despise Bonnie Lee Bakley. But who had despised her enough to kill her? As the sun began to dip below the Los Angeles skyline, Detective Marquez leaned against the precinct's filing cabinets, rubbing his temple. The case wasn't moving in one clear direction. It was branching outward, sprawling into different possibilities, each more tangled than the last. But if there was one thing he was sure of, it was this. Whoever had killed Bonnie hadn't just acted on impulse. This was deliberate, planned, and personal. And soon enough, the truth would start bleeding through the cracks. The case was no longer just a murder investigation. It had become a labyrinth of unanswered questions, hidden motives, and secrets buried beneath the weight of Bonnie Lee Bakley's complicated past. Each piece of evidence uncovered another layer of deception, each clue leading detectives further into a tangled mess of relationships, vendettas, and unfinished business. Nothing about this case was straightforward, and as the days stretched on, the urgency to identify Bonnie's killer grew more intense. At the LAPD Homicide Division, Detective John Marquez sifted through a new batch of reports that had come in overnight. The forensic team had pulled Bonnie's phone records apart, mapping out a digital footprint of her final communications. And though much of it was expected, routine calls, transactions, interactions with people from her life, one detail stood out: the burner phone. Bonnie had called it 6 times in the final 48 hours before she was killed. The number had been traced to a disposable prepaid phone, one that was purchased in cash from a convenience store in West Hollywood 3 weeks before her death. No ID, no credit card trail, no registration. Whoever had owned that phone had gone out of their way to ensure they couldn't be traced. Marquez exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple as he stared at the report. In his years working homicide, he had learned that criminals often left breadcrumbs without realizing it. Nobody erased themselves entirely. There was always something, a slip, a detail overlooked, a connection missed. And then there was the withdrawal of $4,000 from Bonnie's account just days before she died. The money had seemingly vanished into thin air, with no receipts, no deposits, no indication of where it had gone. But Bonnie had been calling someone repeatedly in her final days. Was she paying someone off? Or was she trying to buy her way out of something? The pieces weren't fitting together yet, but there was a picture forming, a transaction, an attempt to make something disappear, and then silence. The detectives widened their focus, looking beyond just Bonnie's final hours and into the people she had surrounded herself with in recent months. This wasn't just about who had the opportunity to kill her. This was about who had something to gain from her death. Bonnie's life had always been defined by her ability to manipulate and control the people around her. She had built a career out of scamming wealthy men, marrying for financial gain, and disappearing before anyone could catch up. She had made enemies, too many to count, but this time she had miscalculated. She had crossed the wrong person, or maybe she had finally lost control of the game she had spent her whole life playing. The investigative team began running background checks on everyone Bonnie had interacted with in the months leading up to her murder. Former lovers, business partners, and even casual acquaintances. The list was long, but certain names began to stand out. First, there was Christian Brando, the troubled son of Hollywood legend Marlon Brando. Bonnie had been deeply entangled with him before Robert Blake entered the picture, originally believing that he was the father of her daughter. The DNA test had proven otherwise, but their relationship had been volatile, marked by tension, resentment, and, according to some, threats. Then there were the men she had scammed. One after another, detectives uncovered stories of betrayal, deceit, and financial ruin. Men who had once been infatuated with Bonnie, only to realize too late that they had been used. Some had lost thousands, others had been left humiliated and angry. And then, of course, there was Robert Blake. His relationship with Bonnie had been strained from the start, a marriage built not on love, but on obligation, resentment, and frustration. Those close to him had heard him speak of her in bitter, exasperated tones, referring to her as a trap he couldn't escape. One acquaintance had even recalled a conversation in which Blake had allegedly joked about wanting her gone. Jokes could be harmless, or they could be something more sinister. As detectives continued their search for answers, new evidence surfaced. A surveillance camera from a gas station near Vitello's had captured an unidentified vehicle circling the area multiple times on the night of the murder. The footage was grainy, difficult to analyze, but one thing was clear. Whoever had been in that car had been watching. The timeline became crucial. Bonnie and Blake had finished dinner. Blake had left her in the car, gone back inside for his gun. Minutes later, 2 gunshots were fired. By the time Blake returned, the killer was gone. If that car had been circling beforehand, then the shooting hadn't been random. It had been planned. Someone had been waiting for the right moment. But who? The question hung over the investigation like a shadow, stretching long into the night as Marquez stared at the case files, knowing they were close to something, but not close enough. The key was somewhere in Bonnie's past, in the final days before her death, and the closer they got, the more dangerous the truth became. The weight of the case hung over the LAPD Homicide Division like an unrelenting storm. The investigation into Bonnie Lee Bakley's murder had unraveled more questions than answers, and each new discovery only deepened the mystery. The pieces were there, scattered and waiting to be assembled, but the detectives knew that the longer it took to put them together, the harder it would be to find the person responsible. Killers who planned their crimes well didn't sit around waiting to be caught. They disappeared into the cracks of the world, leaving only traces, whispers of their presence, before vanishing completely. Detective John Marquez stood in the dimly lit surveillance analysis room, staring at the flickering monitor where grainy footage from a gas station security camera looped on repeat. The footage had been obtained from a location just half a block from Vitello's Italian restaurant, taken at the exact time frame of Bonnie's murder. The timestamp matched. There it was, the unknown vehicle. A dark sedan, make and model indistinguishable under the poor lighting, moved through the frame. It didn't stop at the pump, didn't pull into a parking spot. Instead, it did something more unsettling. It circled. First pass, a slow, deliberate turn past the restaurant parking lot. Second pass, the car vanished beyond the edge of the camera frame, only to reappear minutes later, looping back around. Third pass. This time it hesitated. The brake lights flared for a second before the car disappeared again. And then, 2 gunshots. The timeline aligned too perfectly to be ignored. The car wasn't just passing through the neighborhood. It wasn't lost, wasn't looking for parking. It was waiting, watching. And when the moment came, it was gone, just as fast as it had arrived. Marquez narrowed his eyes. The footage wasn't enough to give them a name, but it gave them a method. This wasn't random violence. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of opportunity. It was precise, planned, and deliberate, which meant that someone had known exactly where Bonnie would be that night. And that meant someone had been watching her before she even got there. The question was who and why. Elsewhere in the precinct, another breakthrough was unfolding. A new lead had emerged in the search for the burner phone Bonnie had repeatedly called in the days before her death. Investigators had finally managed to track down the store where the prepaid device had been purchased, a small convenience shop in West Hollywood. It wasn't much, but it was something. Detectives arrived at the store within the hour, questioning the night clerk who had been working at the time. The man was middle-aged, disinterested, someone who had likely sold dozens of disposable phones without a second thought. When asked about any memory of who might have purchased one a few weeks earlier, he squinted, rubbing his chin in thought. "That's hard to say," he admitted. "We sell a lot of those. People come in, grab one, pay in cash. No names, no IDs. Frustration settled like a stone in the detectives' stomachs. They had expected as much. But then, wait, the clerk muttered suddenly. "I do remember someone, actually. Kind of weird situation. There was a guy, older, real quiet, had a hoodie pulled up. Didn't say much, just pointed at the prepaid phones and handed over cash." The detectives exchanged a glance. "You remember what he looked like?" The clerk hesitated. "I mean, not really. Like I said, he had the hoodie up, didn't really make eye contact. But I do remember one thing. He was nervous. Kept looking over his shoulder, like he thought someone was watching him." That detail sent a ripple through the investigation. Why would someone be paranoid about buying a burner phone? Because they knew someone might come looking for them. The detectives pulled the store's surveillance footage, scouring through weeks of recordings, searching for any sign of the transaction. It took hours, patience stretched thin. But then, there it was, a blurred figure dressed exactly as the clerk had described. The quality was poor, too grainy to distinguish a face, but something about the posture, the way the man moved, was familiar. They had seen this man before. But where? Back at the precinct, the footage was enhanced, analyzed frame by frame, and then a chilling realization. The man bore a striking resemblance to someone already involved in the case. It wasn't Robert Blake. It wasn't Christian Brando. It was someone no one had considered yet, a secondary figure in Bonnie's life, someone who had always been on the periphery, a shadow rather than a presence. And suddenly the case took on an entirely new dimension. Because if this man had been buying an untraceable phone before Bonnie's death, if she had been calling that same phone repeatedly before she was murdered, it meant she hadn't just been afraid. She had been trying to reach him. The surveillance footage from the gas station, the unknown car, the burner phone, all of it was starting to connect. Bonnie hadn't just been targeted that night. She had been hunted, and someone had made sure she didn't live to tell anyone why. The weight of the case had grown heavier with each passing day. The investigation no longer just about solving a murder, but about untangling a web of secrets that stretched beyond the crime itself. Every turn led to another layer of deception, another unanswered question, and the detectives were running out of patience. The case wasn't just complex, it was calculated. Whoever had orchestrated Bonnie Lee Bakley's murder had taken careful steps to ensure that the truth remained buried. But no crime was perfect, and the cracks were beginning to show. The surveillance footage from the West Hollywood convenience store had been analyzed repeatedly, frame by frame, until the grainy image of the man purchasing the burner phone became something more than just a shadow in the investigation. The detectives knew him. His build, his stance, the way he moved. Something about him was familiar, even if his hood was pulled up just enough to obscure his face. Detective John Marquez sat in the precinct's dimly lit briefing room, staring at the enhanced images on the screen. It had taken some time, but when they finally compared the footage to known associates of Robert Blake, the answer had been waiting for them all along. The man buying the burner phone was Duffy Hambleton, a former stuntman and longtime associate of Blake. That discovery changed everything. Hambleton had worked in Hollywood for years, doubling for actors, performing dangerous sequences, blending into the background of films and television shows. But now he wasn't just a name buried in the industry. He was a direct link between Bonnie's desperate attempts to reach someone before she was killed and the men who had surrounded her husband. It didn't end there. A deeper dive into the case revealed another name that detectives had overlooked until now: Ronald "Ronnie" Collins, another stuntman with ties to both Hambleton and Blake. He had been in and out of Hollywood circles, never quite reaching success, but always present in the background. And now he was tied to a burner phone that had become the center of the investigation. The connections couldn't be ignored anymore. If Hambleton and Collins had been involved in any way, then Bonnie's murder wasn't just an act of passion or a robbery gone wrong. It was premeditated. The detectives moved quickly. Within hours, a team was dispatched to bring in Hambleton for questioning. Unlike Robert Blake, who had played the grieving husband in front of the cameras, Hambleton had remained quiet since the murder, his name never surfacing in public speculation. That was about to change. When they finally sat him down in the interrogation room, his demeanor was carefully controlled. He wasn't nervous. Not yet. He had been in high-pressure situations before, had worked in environments where precision and composure were necessary. But the detectives knew what to look for: a slight shift in his breathing, a hesitation before answering, the subtle tension in his jaw when they brought up the phone. Marquez leaned forward, keeping his voice even. "You bought a burner phone a few weeks before Bonnie Bakley was murdered, and then, in the days leading up to her death, she called that phone repeatedly. You see how that looks, right?" Hambleton barely blinked. "I don't know what you're talking about." But they could see it, the flicker of doubt, the momentary break in his confidence. He wasn't expecting them to have that footage. He thought he had erased his tracks. The detectives didn't press too hard, not yet. They let him sit with it, let the silence grow heavier, let the weight of the accusation settle in his mind. Hambleton was the kind of man who knew how to handle physical danger, but psychological pressure was different. Meanwhile, the search for Ronald Collins intensified. Unlike Hambleton, who had at least maintained a public presence, Collins had gone off the radar. He wasn't answering his phone, wasn't at any of his known addresses. The detectives knew what that meant. People didn't disappear for no reason. If Collins was running, then he had something to hide. While the LAPD worked to track him down, they continued dissecting Bonnie's financial activity, phone records, and last movements. The missing $4,000 was still unaccounted for. Where had it gone? Had she been trying to pay someone off? Buy someone's silence? Escape from something? The deeper they looked, the more the timeline made sense. Bonnie had been trying to reach someone for days before she was killed. She had felt watched, had been increasingly paranoid, had made moves that suggested she knew something was coming. And then she was dead. That didn't happen by coincidence. The final piece of the puzzle came when another witness came forward, a former friend of Bonnie's, someone who had known her long before her marriage to Blake. She had received a message from Bonnie a few days before the murder, something cryptic but chilling in retrospect. "If anything happens to me, you know where to look." Bonnie had seen it coming. She just hadn't been able to stop it. The investigation was closing in. Hambleton had been caught in a lie. Collins was still missing, but not for long. And Robert Blake, whether innocent or not, was at the center of it all. The next move was critical, because the truth was finally coming into focus. The case had transformed into something much larger than a simple homicide. It had become a ticking clock, a puzzle that refused to be solved quickly, each new discovery opening yet another corridor into the labyrinth of Bonnie Lee Bakley's final days. The LAPD had peeled back layers of deception, but the truth was still just beyond their grasp. With each step forward, they found themselves entangled deeper in a world of manipulation, hidden alliances, and, above all, a crime that was anything but spontaneous. The arrest of Duffy Hambleton had sent a ripple through the investigation, but it wasn't enough to bring the case to its breaking point. Hambleton had denied everything, even as the detectives presented the footage of him purchasing the burner phone, even as the weight of his own silence pressed against him. He wasn't the type to fold under pressure, not immediately. His years working as a Hollywood stuntman had conditioned him to endure, to withstand, to survive. But he wasn't in control anymore, and he knew it. His refusal to talk only solidified one thing in the detectives' minds. He was protecting someone, or he was terrified of something even worse than being caught. But there was still one loose thread that needed to be pulled: Ronald Collins. Unlike Hamilton, Collins had gone underground. There were no sightings, no phone activity, no credit card transactions. He had vanished in a way that only meant one of two things. Either he had orchestrated his own disappearance, or someone had ensured that he wouldn't be found. That uncertainty was dangerous. A suspect who was running was one thing. A suspect who had been silenced was something else entirely. Detective John Marquez wasn't the type to believe in coincidences, and Bonnie's murder had never felt like one to begin with. Now, with Hamilton caught in a lie and Collins missing, the scope of the crime had shifted from a single act of violence to something more deliberate, more methodical. Someone had orchestrated this, planned it down to the smallest details, and had done so with the confidence of knowing they would get away with it. The search for Collins intensified. Teams were sent to known addresses, former residences, locations where he had once been seen with Hamilton or Blake. Every lead was pursued, every possibility explored. It wasn't until one of the officers checked a rundown motel outside of Los Angeles that the first real break came. Collins hadn't registered under his own name, but someone at the front desk recognized his description when shown a photo. He had been there. The room was already empty by the time the police arrived. The bed was unmade, the trash can filled with cigarette butts, the faintest trace of aftershave lingering in the air. He had been there recently, but not long enough to stay. The motel clerk hesitated when asked if Collins had left alone. There was someone else, he admitted after a moment. Didn't get a good look. Just someone in a car, waiting. That statement sent a chill through the investigators. Collins wasn't just hiding, he had help. Back at the precinct, Hamilton had been left to sit with his own thoughts, the weight of his own decisions, the silence of an empty interrogation room. It was the kind of pressure that broke people down in ways that no amount of questioning could. The moment he was left alone, he knew that time wasn't on his side. He could keep denying, keep pretending, but the detectives weren't going to let this case fade. They were going to keep coming, keep asking, keep digging until there was nowhere left for him to hide. And then it happened. A mistake. Not by Hamilton, not by Collins, by whoever had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. A phone call was intercepted, a brief exchange, a whisper of something bigger happening behind the curtain. Someone had reached out, someone tied to the case, someone who hadn't expected the investigation to last this long. The voice was distorted, but the words were clear. They're getting too close. Handle it. It wasn't enough to confirm an identity, but it was enough to confirm what the detectives already knew. Bonnie's murder hadn't been an isolated event. It was part of a larger plan, one that was now unraveling under the weight of scrutiny. Whoever had orchestrated her death had assumed that the investigation would stall, that the pieces would never align, that the chaos surrounding Bonnie's past would be enough to bury the truth. But the cracks had started to show, and no matter how carefully they had planned, they hadn't accounted for one thing: persistence. The walls were closing in, and soon the entire foundation would collapse. The investigation had reached a boiling point. For weeks, the LAPD had been peeling back the layers of deception surrounding Bonnie Lee Bakley's murder, moving through a maze of hidden motives and shifting alibis. Every step forward had led to more questions, more uncertainty, but now the picture was finally coming into focus. The walls were closing in, and the people involved knew it. Someone was running out of time. Detective John Marquez sat in the dimly lit briefing room, staring at the mounting evidence laid out before him. The burner phone, the surveillance footage, the intercepted call, and the missing $4,000. Everything pointed to a conspiracy larger than just a simple murder. The problem was proving it. Ronald Collins was still missing. Every lead that had placed him near the city had evaporated before they could reach him. But the last confirmed sighting, at the motel where someone had picked him up, suggested he wasn't acting alone. Someone had helped him disappear. Someone who knew exactly how high the stakes were. Meanwhile, Duffy Hamilton was breaking down. Days of questioning had taken their toll. His silence, which had once felt impenetrable, was beginning to crack. At first, he had tried to act as though he had no idea what was going on. But as soon as he realized Collins was missing and might not return, his demeanor shifted. Fear. That was what Marquez saw when he stepped into the interrogation room. Hambleton wasn't just worried about being caught. He was afraid of something bigger. He knew something, and whatever it was enough to make him hesitate before speaking. Marquez sat down across from him, letting the silence stretch between them. He didn't press, didn't demand answers. He just waited. Finally, Hambleton exhaled. "I didn't pull the trigger," he muttered, almost to himself. Marquez didn't react, didn't push him further. He let the words settle. "But you know who did," Marquez said quietly. Hambleton ran a hand down his face, avoiding eye contact. He was still hesitating, still weighing the consequences of what he was about to say. "Collins," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was Collins." There it was, the first real confession. Ronald Collins had been there the night Bonnie was murdered. He hadn't just been a bystander. He had been the one to pull the trigger. But Marquez knew better than to assume it was that simple. Collins might have been the one who fired the shots, but he wasn't the mastermind. Someone had orchestrated this, set everything in motion, made sure Bonnie wouldn't walk away that night. And all signs still pointed back to Robert Blake. The detectives wasted no time putting together a task force to track down Collins. They couldn't afford to wait, not when they finally had a direct accusation tying him to the crime. Every available resource was used, tracing financial records, tapping into informants, checking any location where Collins had been known to stay. They weren't looking for a witness anymore. They were hunting a fugitive. It took less than 24 hours before they got their break. Collins had been hiding out in a trailer park on the outskirts of San Bernardino, staying under an alias, trying to avoid detection. When the LAPD arrived, there was no dramatic escape attempt, no last-minute chase. Collins knew it was over. He was taken into custody without resistance. But that didn't mean he was ready to talk. Unlike Hambleton, Collins wasn't afraid of the police. He was afraid of whoever had sent him to do the job. At the station, he refused to speak, refused to acknowledge his role in the crime. But the evidence was already stacking against him. The burner phone, the car seen circling Vitello's the night of the murder, the surveillance footage from the convenience store, and now Hambleton's confession. He had two choices: take the fall alone, or finally reveal who had given the order. When Marquez entered the room, Collins was already slouched back in his chair, arms crossed, jaw tight. He had the look of a man who knew exactly what was coming. "You don't have many options left," Marquez said, placing the evidence folder on the table. "Your friend already gave you up. We know you were there. We know you pulled the trigger." Collins didn't flinch. "You think I care about what he says?" he muttered. Marquez leaned forward. "I think you care about what happens next. Because right now, you're the only one looking at life in prison. Maybe worse. You think whoever put you up to this is going to come save you?" That got to him. Collins shifted, his fingers tapping against the metal table. He wasn't ready to fold completely, but he knew Marquez was right. Whoever had hired him, whoever had made sure Bonnie wouldn't make it out of that car alive, wasn't going to protect him now. Collins exhaled sharply, running his tongue over his teeth. "You already know who it was," he muttered. Marquez didn't let his expression change, but inside he knew this was it. "We need you to say it." Collins hesitated for only a moment longer before finally giving them what they had been waiting for. "It was Blake," he said. "Robert Blake set it all up." The case that had gripped Hollywood and stunned the nation had reached its inevitable conclusion. For months, the investigation had peeled back the carefully constructed image surrounding Robert Blake, exposing the cracks beneath the surface of his public persona. What had once been the story of a washed-up actor caught in the tragic loss of his wife had unraveled into something much darker. A conspiracy, a premeditated execution, a calculated attempt to rid himself of a woman he no longer wanted in his life. With Ronald Collins' confession, the final piece had fallen into place. He had placed the blame squarely on Robert Blake, stating that the actor had orchestrated the murder from the beginning. The plan had been cold, methodical. Bonnie was meant to be silenced, and Blake had ensured that there were people willing to do the job for him. The LAPD wasted no time. Robert Blake was arrested on charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation of murder. The moment his handcuffs clicked into place, The man who had once been a respected television star, known for his role as the tough yet charismatic detective in Beretta, became something else entirely. A cautionary tale of power, ego, and desperation. The arrest sent shockwaves through Hollywood. The press swarmed outside the LAPD headquarters, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions that Blake ignored as he was led into the back of a squad car. He didn't struggle. He didn't react. He simply lowered his head and let it happen. The trial became one of the most sensationalized legal battles in modern Hollywood history. The prosecution presented a damning case. They had Collins' confession, Hamilton's involvement, the burner phone, the car circling the restaurant, and the timeline that pointed to premeditation. Every piece of evidence told the same story. Blake had wanted Bonnie gone, and he had taken steps to ensure it happened. But then, as often happens in high-profile cases, the defense fought back. Hard. Blake's attorneys dismantled the testimonies of Collins and Hamilton, painting them as unreliable witnesses with their own criminal past. The lack of physical evidence directly tying Blake to the shooting became their strongest argument. Then came the bombshell. Despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, the prosecution lacked the murder weapon, fingerprints, or a direct witness placing Blake at the scene during the exact moment of the crime. And in the end, that was enough to cast doubt. After a highly publicized trial, with cameras capturing every moment, Robert Blake was acquitted of the murder charge. The moment the verdict was read, gasps filled the courtroom. Some in the gallery shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered, speculated, wondered how a case that had seemed so airtight had just crumbled before their eyes. Blake, the man who had been painted as a cold-blooded orchestrator of his wife's execution, walked free. But freedom was an illusion. Though he had been acquitted in criminal court, the civil case against him painted a different story. Bonnie's children filed a wrongful death lawsuit, and this time, without the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, the jury ruled against him. Blake was found liable for Bonnie's death and ordered to pay $30 million in damages. It was a symbolic victory for Bonnie's family, but it came at a cost. The money was never fully paid. Blake declared bankruptcy soon after, his fortune drained by legal fees, the weight of the case leaving his career in ruins. He had escaped prison, but he had lost everything else. And yet, in the end, the question still lingered in the minds of many. Did justice truly prevail? Some believed Blake had been unfairly accused, that the case had been built on unreliable witnesses with personal motivations. Others were certain he had gotten away with the perfect crime, aided by a legal system that often favored those with money and influence. But perhaps the greatest tragedy of all was Bonnie Lee Bakley herself. She had lived a life filled with deception, always searching for security, always playing the game, until she finally met an opponent who refused to let her win. She had sensed danger in the days leading up to her death, had reached out to the wrong people for help, had perhaps even known what was coming. Yet she hadn't been able to stop it. Her life was a reflection of the darker corners of Hollywood, a world where fame and fortune collided with desperation and deception, where power was a currency, and where people like Bonnie, who had built their existence on survival, often found themselves outmaneuvered in the end. The case of Robert Blake and Bonnie Lee Bakley became more than just another Hollywood scandal. It became a parable of consequence, a reminder that even the most carefully orchestrated plans can unravel, that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface. Blake lived out the rest of his years in obscurity, his name forever tied to a crime that, despite his acquittal, the world never truly forgave him for. And Bonnie? She remained a ghost in the shadows of Hollywood, a name whispered in true crime documentaries, a cautionary figure in the annals of crime history. Her death was tragic, her life even more so, and in the end, the truth was left for history to decide. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.